Loud and clear.
From the studios of Radio Sputnik in downtown Washington, D.C., it's Loud and Clear. We take you inside the news 5 days a week. It's happening, and it's happening now. I'm Brian Becker. But first, we turn to the creation of the National Trade Council by Donald Trump. We are joined from London by Keith Bennett, a researcher and analyst on Chinese politics and international relations who advises both Chinese and Western companies. After graduating from London's School of Oriental and African Studies in Chinese History and Politics in 1979, he worked for the Society for Anglo-Chinese Understanding. He has visited China literally hundreds of times, first in April 1981, and most recently, last weekend, has met many of the country's top leaders. Welcome, Keith.
Welcome. Thanks so much.
Thank you for joining us. Well, these are eventful times. At first, when Donald Trump took the call from the leader of Taiwan, it was thought to be perhaps just a casual call. He said, he sort of sloughed it off and said, we give Taiwan billions. Why shouldn't I take a congratulatory call? But since then, his pronouncements have been increasingly hostile to China. And now the appointment as one of his top economic advisors of Peter Navarro, I mean, things are coming to a head. What do you think?
I think it's a very serious situation. As you know, Donald Trump has said all sorts of things on the campaign trail and subsequently. But in fairness, I think one of the things you can say is that where he's been consistent is that he's been consistently hostile to China. And I wouldn't really take too much at face value the idea that this call with the leader of Taiwan was some kind of aberration. These things don't happen by accident. They're carefully set up. And people like Navarro have been around Trump advising him. And Navarro's policy on China is extremely hostile all along the line, not just on the question of trade, but also on the question of Taiwan, where he had an article published recently, on the question of China's social system and so on.
Exactly. And as we learned after the call with the leader of Taiwan, the Heritage Foundation had been there for months setting up the call. In other words, this was a pre-planned, calculated effort. And then Trump, when the Chinese were starting to protest, they were shocked, I think, at first, because his first call with Xi Jinping was reported in the Chinese media as a friendly call, something that expressed mutual respect, et cetera, et cetera. But afterwards, Trump said, well, why should we be bound by the one China policy, which, of course, is the bedrock for U.S.-China bilateral relations? Help our global audience, we have a U.S. audience and a global audience, explain why Taiwan is so important from the point of view of the Chinese.
Well, first of all, the one China policy is the bedrock not only of China-U.S. relations, but the relations between China and any other foreign country. And in terms of the China-U.S. relationship, we have to take this back to February 1972 when Richard Nixon visited China. And in the course of that visit, they adopted something called the Shanghai Communique, which is the foundation of all the U.S.-China relations that followed. And in the Shanghai Communique, the United States says that it acknowledges the view of all Chinese on both sides of the Taiwan Straits that there is only one China. And I think you have to understand this is not simply a policy of the Communist Party. Chairman Mao is reported to have said that the one thing that he and Chiang Kai-shek, the right-wing leader of the nationalist Kuomintang on Taiwan, agreed on was that there was only one China in the world. They had very profound and bloody disagreements as to which class should lead that China, but they had agreement on the one China policy. And if you then look at Obama's stance on this, I mean, in many respects, Obama has made a pretty messy job of relations with China, in my view, in terms of the so-called pivot to Asia, TPP, and so on. But he was completely accurate when he gave a rather guarded and diplomatic, but nevertheless strong warning to Trump that the one China issue goes to the core of how the Chinese see themselves as a nation, and that whilst you can engage strongly with China on other subjects, that this is something that they will treat in a different way. And I think to really understand this, you have to go back to the point that the Chinese Revolution, right from the start, has always had a dual character. It's had the character of being a revolution of workers and peasants to set up a socialist society, but it's also been a revolution of the entire Chinese people in order to overcome the national humiliation, which began with the British waging the Opium Wars against China in the 1840s. And the reunification of Taiwan with the mainland is the last outstanding piece of that national liberation struggle of the Chinese people. And it's something that simply no Chinese government can afford to compromise on. In the Chinese response to the phone call that Trump had, at first they were rather cautious. I think that was because they were, working out their response. It wasn't to indicate that they took it lightly. But afterwards they came out and they said that if the one China policy is not some kind of transactional business arrangement, that if there's no acceptance of the one China policy, then there is simply nothing serious to discuss between China and the United States. And that obviously means issues like climate change, Iran, and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea.
We're speaking with Keith Bennett from London. He is an expert on U.S.-China relations and on China's developmental model and on Chinese cross-Taiwan Strait relations. We're talking about the appointment by Donald Trump of Peter Navarro, a real fierce critic of China, and the other pronouncements and proclamations by the President-elect Trump, prior to his ascension to the White House on January 20th. According to The Guardian, Keith, Navarro believes that the Chinese government, quote, is a despicable, parasitic, brutal, brass-knuckled, crass, callous, amoral, ruthless, and totally totalitarian imperialist power that reigns over the world's leading cancer factory, its most prolific propaganda mill, and the biggest police state and prison on the face of the earth. Well, okay, you just can't get more hyperbolic, more hostile than that. The Chinese are reading that. They're thinking, okay, we've had cordial relations, challenged relations, of course, but more or less still friendly relations with the United States, even after Obama announced the Asia pivot. But they must be preparing now. For something that's almost a near state of confrontation. What do you think?
Well, it could very easily go that way. I think the only thing one can say about Navarro's proclamations is that they are so extreme that one would like to think that there would have to be a certain rowing back from them, on the grounds that the situation that's developed over the last 4 decades or so has really bound the United States and China together in all sorts of ways, particularly on the economic front. And it's very easy to make those kind of statements. I think Navarro will be very challenged in actually trying to implement them in practice. But clearly, to the extent that he does, then the U.S.-China relationship is going to go downhill very rapidly.
Donald Trump may be considering that Navarro's statements and his own proclamations, his own hard line against China, are part of a leveraging, sort of the art of the deal in the form of international diplomacy. But nonetheless, the Chinese have a few cards to play, too. I mean, the U.S. and China's economies are integrated. China is a driver of the world economy. 40% of the world's GDP is in Asia now, and China holds a big part of U.S. debt.
Absolutely, we're going to enter clearly into a very challenging period. The cards are not all held by the United States, as you said, as people in China have already said that in the event of a trade war between the U.S. and China, then Boeing's loss is Airbus's gain. Or if they don't buy soybeans from Midwestern United States, they can buy them from Brazil and Argentina. And I think that the Trump camp is going to have real difficulty disentangling all of this. First of all, modern capitalist production is a highly complex, integrated international division of labor these days. If one takes, for the example of an iPhone, it's not possible to simply switch that part of production or assembly that's done in China over to the U.S. Secondly, by and large, I'd say the U.S. working class has not yet suffered a defeat on the scale that would make possible or acceptable the kind of wages to be paid in the United States industry that workers in the global South are paid. Moreover, denying Chinese goods entry into the U.S. market is going to push up prices paid by U.S. working and middle-class people. And China itself has already started to move away, quite some years ago now, from a low-cost, low-wage cost, export-oriented development model. And already, many of these jobs that were previously in China have now actually gone, for example, in textiles or shoe manufacture, have gone from China to countries like Vietnam or Cambodia, Bangladesh or Ethiopia. And finally on this, there's an article in the New York Times today which has the very interesting headline, "The long-term jobs killer is not China, it's automation." And that we see that that reflected in the appointment of Posda as Trump's Labor Secretary, a passionate opponent of the minimum wage, who said that he would welcome the fact that in his fast food empire, if they could actually move, that the food would be cooked and served by robots and he wouldn't have to employ anybody at all. That's the real danger to the U.S. working class. But in trying to scapegoat Chinese workers or Mexican workers or minority workers at home, this is just the classic recipe of fascism.
Yeah, I think, Keith, the article you're referring to is the article from the New York Times. As the means of production, as you mentioned, develop, as more sophisticated machines and techniques are introduced, fewer workers are needed to create the same quantity of goods. The Times in that article said, take the steel industry, it lost 400,000 people, 75% of its workforce between 1962 and 2005. But its shipments did not decline, according to a study published in the American Economic Review last year. The reason was a new technology called the mini-mill. Its effect remained strong even after controlling for management practices, job losses in the Midwest, international trade, and unionization rates, found the authors of the study. It's ironic that the introduction of new technology, which could mean lessening the workload of workers, just really means putting them into the garbage dump, so to speak, because if employers don't employ them, if they can employ machines or use robots, then they're out of the job. And here you have Donald Trump and right-wing politicians saying, well, the problem really isn't this. It's not the social and economic order and how it handles the issue of automation and technology and the elimination of redundant labor. The problem really is China. So it's trying to create an ocean of hatred against China for an economic and political problem that won't go away no matter what happens.
Exactly. Obviously, automation, robotization, and so on are the things, these developments of the productive forces, are the things that could give a decent life to every human being on the planet. The problem is not with automation. The problem lies with the social system, whether it's used for private profit or for public good. But this question that you've touched on, this has always been the capitalist attempt way of trying to get out of their problems. It goes right back to what Marx said about the existence of two hostile camps among the working class in England between English and Irish workers. And Marx said that the antagonism created between English and Irish workers was the way that the capitalist class continued to rule. Donald Trump is just rolling the same thing out against Chinese workers, Mexican workers, and against African Americans, Native Americans, and other minorities at home.
Keith Bennett, President Obama announced the Asia pivot. This appears to be the Asia pivot with a vengeance. Under President Obama, the Pentagon was planning to put in the Pacific region by 2020, 60% of the U.S. Air Force assets, 60% of the naval assets. That was clearly perceived by China as a containment strategy, threatening China in its own backyard, so to speak. But even though Trump has said he wants to press the reset button, so to speak, with Russia, if he goes forward with this extremely hostile policy towards China economically and, of course, militarily, and as both sides climb the escalation ladder, at least in terms of rhetoric, what does that mean? Because, of course, China these days has been a primary ally of Putin and Russia.
The first thing to be said is that if President Putin can engage with Donald Trump to get the sanctions lifted on the Russian Federation, that's his responsibility and duty as the president of Russia. But when it comes to China, Trump is also attacking them on the issue of the South China Sea. He is criticizing them for not putting more pressure on the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Indeed, on one occasion, he even appeared to suggest that China should be faulted for not launching an invasion of the DPRK. There are the tensions in the Asia-Pacific region can only be expected to increase. There may be some political forces in Russia that feel that they can, if you like, do a Nixon in reverse, or rather Trump would like to do a Nixon in reverse with Russia. But I really don't think that the Russia, although that has some support among people in Russia, certain people in Russia, I really don't think that it's something that the Russian government is going to fall for.
Yeah, and when you look at the Trump cabinet, James Mad Dog Mattis is the Department of Defense, Secretary of Defense, General Flynn, Secretary or National Security Advisor, General Kelly in charge of Homeland Security. These people, and especially Mattis, who I think will be the primary foreign policy voice within the cabinet, they're not friends of Russia. They're mainstream Washington consensus, Pentagon sort of central figures, and push comes to shove, I think they are going to continue the incentivizing of the military-industrial complex, including the way the rivalry has been played out in Eastern and Central Europe, which again must be perceived by Russia and China and all the other countries that are trying to be independent from the United States as a very dangerous step. But we are out of time. We've been talking with Keith Bennett from London. You are listening to Loud and Clear. We'll be back.